Daniel noticed the change before his mind was ready to name it. The way Laura's hand slipped from his as they entered the restaurant.
Hello.
The way her eyes searched the room as if she were looking for something already promised.
Oh,
The place was warm and familiar, a small family restaurant near the lake in upstate New York where they had eaten many times before. And Daniel tried to settle into the comfort of routine, but something inside him stayed alert, sharp, uneasy. Laura smiled at him, but it felt practiced, like a line she had repeated too often that day, and when she excused herself to wash her hands. Another man stood up from the corner table almost at the same moment. His name was Ethan, someone Daniel knew only through stories from Laura's office, a name that came up more often than it should have, usually followed by quick explanations that never quite landed. Daniel watched as Laura paused near him, heard the low murmur of their voices, saw the way they leaned slightly toward each other. It's close enough to share warmth, close enough to share secrets, and when Laura gestured toward the hallway that led to the restrooms, Daniel felt a slow, heavy drop in his chest, as if an answer had arrived before the question was fully formed. He did not follow them, did not call out, did not move at all at first, because some part of him still wanted to believe there was another reason. An innocent reason, one that did not break the careful shape of the life they had built together. Over 12 years of marriage, moving from Ohio to New York, changing jobs, losing parents, gaining habits, learning each other's silences. Instead, Daniel turned toward the open kitchen area, where a cook nodded at him, and without thinking too much, he asked if he could use the stove, explaining he had once worked in a restaurant and just needed something to do while he waited. The cook shrugged, amused, and Daniel found himself standing in front of a burner, lighting it with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. The blue flame came alive, steady and calm, and Daniel focused on it because it did not lie to him, because it did exactly what it was meant to do. He picked up a knife, began chopping onions with quick, clean movements, his hands moving faster than his thoughts, the sharp scent rising and stinging his eyes in a way that felt almost welcome. As he cooked, memories pushed forward without permission. Not slow and gentle, but fast and sharp. Laura laughing in their first tiny apartment. Laura crying when Daniel lost his job. Laura promising that no matter what, they would always be honest with each other, even when honesty hurt. He added oil to the pan, listened to it sizzle, and told himself this was just nerves, that he was reading too much into a moment. But the minutes stretched on. Longer than necessary, long enough for doubt to grow roots. Round him, the restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations, forks clinking, glasses lifting. Normal life moving forward without pause, and Daniel felt strangely separate from it, as if he were standing behind glass. He stirred the pan, kept his movements smooth and controlled, because stopping would mean thinking. And thinking would mean imagining Laura behind that closed door, choosing words, choosing distance, choosing someone else. He remembered how lately she had come home later, how she checked her phone and smiled at messages she never shared, how she said work was just stressful, how he had accepted that explanation because it was easier than asking for more. The burner continued to burn, patient and bright. And Daniel realized he was cooking not for hunger but for survival. Because as long as he kept moving, he did not have to decide what he already knew. A server passed by and gave him a curious look, but said nothing, and Daniel was grateful for that small mercy. He tasted the sauce, adjusted it quickly, efficiently, and wondered when love had become something that needed fixing instead of something that simply existed. The hallway remained quiet, the restroom door unseen but heavy in his mind. And Daniel understood then that even if Laura walked back out alone, even if she smiled and said nothing had happened, something already had. The flame under the pan flickered slightly, responding to a small draft. And Daniel felt the same unsteady shift inside himself, a warning that whatever came next would change the shape of his life, whether he was ready or not. And with that thought, he kept cooking, because for this moment, it was the only honest thing he could do. Asterisk, the pan grew hotter as Daniel worked. And with every stir, the weight in his chest shifted from shock to clarity. Sharp and unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. He moved fast, not because the food needed it, but because stillness felt dangerous. Because stopping might allow his thoughts to slow and turn cruel. Garlic hit the oil, the smell filling the space, pulling him back to years when cooking meant comfort and connection. When Laura would lean against the counter and talk about her day while he listened and pretended not to enjoy the sound of her voice more than the words themselves. The same memory felt distant, like a place he once lived but could no longer reach. He glanced toward the hallway again, his eyes moving before his mind could stop them, counting time in heartbeats, telling himself that a restroom visit did not take this long, that private conversations did not belong there, that even if nothing physical had happened, something important had already crossed a line. A server passed behind him and asked softly if he needed anything, and Daniel shook his head, keeping his voice steady when he thanked her, surprised at how normal he sounded, how easy it was to hide damage when no one was looking directly at it. He added tomatoes to the pan, watched them break down under the heat, and thought about how love worked the same way. Strong at first, full of shape, then slowly changing when pressure stayed too long. Laura had not meant for this to happen. He was sure of that, because she was not careless with people's feelings. At least she had not been before. But intentions did not erase choices, and choices had a way of leaving marks. He remembered small moments he had ignored, the way she had grown quiet during dinners, the way she avoided long talks, the way she said she was tired when he reached for her hand. And he wondered if Ethan had seen those same signs and read them differently, not as distance, but as invitation. The burner hummed steadily, patient and indifferent. And Daniel realized he envied it, envied its clear purpose. Simple rule that heat caused change and nothing more was expected of it. His hands moved with practiced ease, seasoning, tasting, adjusting, and he wondered if Laura had noticed how often he cooked lately, how it had become his shield against questions neither of them wanted to ask. From the hallway came a faint sound, not words, just movement. And Daniel's breath caught before he forced it back into place, reminding himself that imagination could be as painful as truth if given too much room. He thought about their life. Outside this moment, the house they shared, the routines that filled their days, the plans they had postponed but never canceled, and he tried to picture those things surviving this night. Tried to see a future where this was only a difficult chapter and not the ending of the story. The sauce thickened, steam rising, blurring his vision for a second, and he welcomed it. Welcomed anything that softened the edges of what he was facing. He told himself he would not shout, would not accuse without listening, because anger felt easy and understanding felt hard, and he had never chosen the easy path in his marriage. Still, a quiet resolve began to form beneath the confusion. I sensed that whatever explanation came next would need to be honest, or it would mean nothing at all. The restaurant noise faded into the background as Daniel focused on finishing the dish, aware that cooking had become more than a distraction. That it was now a way of preparing himself for what waited on the other side of that door. The food carefully, the way he always did, with attention and respect, 'cause care had always been his language, even when words failed him. As he set the plates down, he realized the waiting was almost over, and instead of relief, he felt a calm determination settle in. The kind that came when a person stopped hoping for a different truth and decided to face the one already unfolding, knowing that once the door opened, there would be no returning to the simple warmth they had walked into the restaurant with, only the honest heat of whatever came next. Asterisk, the restroom door opened before Daniel could even realize he was holding his breath. And the sight of Laura stepping out made the world shrink into a single sharp focus. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, smoothing the coat she had thrown over her shoulders, her eyes flicking toward Daniel as if searching for permission to exist in the same space. Behind her, Ethan lingered for a moment, awkward and unsure, his polite smile failing to mask the tension in his shoulders, the quiet apology written in his hesitant posture. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not with rage, not with immediate anger, but with the complicated knot of relief, fear, and hurt that had been building for weeks. The restaurant around them continued its quiet rhythm, servers moving, plates clinking, conversations flowing, but for him, time seemed suspended, stretched into long seconds where nothing could be spoken without shaking the fragile balance. Laura's eyes met his, and in them he saw more than regret. He saw the struggle of a person realizing the weight of their choices, the uncomfortable truth that intentions cannot erase consequences. Daniel set the plates of food he had prepared on the counter, the steam rising in soft swirls that blurred the edges of the moment. And he realized that cooking had been his anchor, a way to focus his mind on something real while emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Ethan's presence became smaller in his awareness, a shadow retreating quietly as Daniel stayed grounded by the simple, ordinary act of putting food on a plate, a reminder that life carried on even when hearts were shaking. Laura spoke first, her voice low but steady, admitting softly that she had meant to tell him sooner that the conversation had not been easy for her, that mistakes had been made, but words alone could not undo the ache that had quietly grown between them. Daniel listened without interrupting, his gaze moving between the food, the floor, and her face, noticing the subtle tremor in her hands, the pause before her next sentence, the honesty that came not from confession but from vulnerability. He did not ask for details because in this moment, clarity mattered more than curiosity, understanding more than accusation. And he realized that sometimes silence carries more weight than questions. The tension in the room began to shift as Ethan murmured a brief apology and retreated, the door closing behind him with a quiet click that echoed in the sudden emptiness of the space. Daniel felt a mixture of gratitude and unease, knowing the path ahead would be long and uncertain, that this small act of separation was only the first step toward confronting the reality they had avoided for too long. Laura carried the plate toward the table, her movements careful, her eyes occasionally meeting his with the flicker of hope that they might still find a way to speak, to repair, to rebuild. Daniel followed, not because he needed to oversee her actions, but because his presence alone had become a silent language of steadiness, a reminder that he had not abandoned the connection they had forged over years of shared life. They sat down, across from each other, the food between them acting as both shield and bridge. A simple meal grounding them in reality as their hearts and minds wrestled with the enormity of unspoken truths. Words began to emerge, slow, deliberate, chosen with care. And Daniel listened as Laura admitted fears, regrets, and moments of weakness, revealing a side of herself that she had hidden even from herself, while he shared the quiet realization that love is not always about perfection, but about presence, about being there even when the world feels like it is shifting under your feet. The air felt charged but not hostile, electric with honesty instead of anger. And Daniel realized that the real test was not whether they could undo the past, but whether they could face it without losing the foundation of care and commitment that had held them together so far. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, and Daniel thought of it as a kind of cleansing. A reminder that even after the heaviest storms, life continued to move, and so must they. As the meal progressed, the tension gradually eased, replaced by a tentative understanding that mistakes had been made. Yes, but they did not have to define the entire story. And that sometimes the act of simply being present, simply listening, simply sharing a quiet meal could begin the slow work of healing. Daniel noticed the small gestures, the way Laura's hand hovered near his for a moment before resting on the table, the subtle nods that conveyed apology without words, the soft sighs that spoke of longing for what had been and hope for what could still be. By the time the plates were empty, there was no sudden resolution, no miraculous return to the way things had been. But there was a fragile bridge built from honesty, awareness, and a shared commitment to face the truth together. Daniel realized that while the road ahead would be uncertain, they had begun it. And the first step had been taken not in shouting or blame, but in presence, in steady action, and in choosing to confront reality rather than escape it. A lesson that would carry them far if only they kept walking it carefully, side by side. Daniel stepped outside into the night air. Sharp and cold, the snow crunching under his shoes and the lake reflecting the faint glow of distant streetlights. He could still feel the weight of the conversation inside, the unspoken words, the awkward pauses, the tension that had settled between him and Laura after the meal. He did not look at her immediately, letting the cold wrap around him, studying. His mind, after the storm of emotions that had spun so fast it left him dizzy. Laura joined him slowly, her breath forming soft clouds in front of her face, and for a moment they stood apart, not touching, not speaking, just existing in the quiet that only a frozen night could give. Then she spoke, her voice low but firm, admitting that she did not expect immediate forgiveness, that she only wanted to share the truth, to let him know what had been on her mind and what she had felt. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding that this was the first step toward any kind of repair. It's the first moment in which honesty had the chance to take root where secrecy had grown. He looked at the frozen lake, the dark water smooth and unbroken, and realized that life was much like this ice, delicate yet strong, able to carry weight if handled carefully, but capable of cracking if pressure was too sudden. They began walking. Along the edge of the lake, footsteps overlapping, silence stretching, but not uncomfortably so. And Daniel felt that the cold had a way of clearing thoughts, of making reality sharp and clear, impossible to avoid or soften. Laura spoke again, carefully choosing her words, talking about regrets, the small choices that had led them here, the moments she wished she could take back, but also about her hope that they could face these things together, that they could find a way to rebuild trust step by step. Daniel listened, not rushing her, not interrupting, letting her speak because he knew that hearing her fully, without judgment, was part of what this night demanded. He thought about the past, about years of shared memories, about the promises they had made when love felt simple and certain. And he realized that even though things had changed, even though trust had been tested, the foundation of care and connection they had built could still exist if nurtured carefully. Laura admitted that she had feared losing him, that her actions had been confusing even to herself. And Daniel felt a mixture of sadness and understanding, knowing that mistakes were human, but also knowing that forgiveness required courage from both sides. They stopped at a bench near the lake, sitting side by side, the silence now more reflective than tense. The cold pressing against their bodies, but also bringing clarity, sharpening their thoughts and feelings. Daniel spoke then, not in anger, not in accusation, but in steady, deliberate words, sharing that love is more than perfection, that mistakes do not erase the years of shared life. And that presence, honesty, and effort were the real measures of commitment. Laura nodded, tears glinting in her eyes from the reflection of the streetlights, acknowledging that she had failed in some ways, but expressing a desire to move forward, to rebuild, to take responsibility for the future rather than dwell endlessly on the past. Daniel could feel the weight lifting slightly, replaced by a cautious hope, a sense that even after betrayal or confusion, careful steps could lead to understanding, that connection could survive if both were willing to act with honesty and care. They spoke in soft tones, sometimes pausing to gather thoughts, sometimes laughing quietly at small memories that reminded them of why they had fallen in love in the first place. And in those moments, the night seemed less cold, the lake less distant, and the world less chaotic. Daniel realized that the stove inside, now cold, had prepared him for this moment, had taught him that heat and focus, patience and care could stabilize what felt unstable, that creating something with intention could anchor a mind shaken by fear and heartbreak. They stayed by the lake until the air began to bite harder, until the reflection of lights on the water became faint, until they both knew it was time to return to the warmth inside, carrying with them the fragile hope that the night had given them a beginning rather than an ending. As they walked back, shoulders almost touching, Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and determination, knowing the journey ahead would be slow, but that they had started it, that they had faced truth, and that they had done so together. He realized that some flames, like the burner he had lit earlier, were meant not just to cook or comfort, but to reveal, to show what needed attention, to burn away illusions and leave only what was honest and real. And in that honesty, in that quiet courage, Daniel and Laura understood that love could survive imperfection, that trust could be rebuilt if both were willing, and that even after pain, careful steps forward could lead to a future where connection and care were restored, stronger for the truths they had faced.